starting in chapter 13, verse 1, says, "When Ephraim spoke, people trembled. He was exalted in Israel, but he became guilty of Baal worship and died." So Ephraim, as we know, had the firstborn blessing, even though he was the younger sibling. So spiritually, he kind of has that double blessing. Ephraim was also respected in Israel for their military influence. They had many successful battles in the north, and in the midst of being surrounded by kind of all these pagan nations, they had carved a place for themselves. Ephraim is also seen as a very influential tribe. Joshua comes from Ephraim, and so because they were worshiping idols, it was probably going to be replicated across Israel. The verse 2 also says that they started to offer human sacrifices, which I think there's just so much grace that God doesn't destroy them immediately because of that. I think most of us would kind of draw that line then and there, but they are still God's children. They're still part of his chosen people, and they've made that commitment with him. So where we would write them off, God shows them grace. And I know that people love to say that the God of the Old Testament is cruel and harsh, but I think that's not the case if you really read. And so through Hosea, God does share what will happen if they continue in this sinful behavior. Verse 3 says, "Therefore they will be like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears, like a chaff swirling from the threshing floor, like smoke escaping through a window." So this destruction will be brought on by the Assyrian Empire, which is one of their close neighbors. And eventually that does happen. Ephraim doesn't heed the warning from God. And while most of that northern kingdom has been restored to Israel, there are still areas of land that haven't. So there are very real consequences for their actions. Moving on to verse 6, what caused them to be led astray? Verse 6 says, "When I fed them, they were satisfied. When they were satisfied, they became proud, and then they forgot me." And so this is where I found the portion to be relatable, and I really started to connect with it. Because I think it can sometimes be hard to put yourself in Israel's shoes at the time. They're kind of a hard people to root for, and it's difficult to understand why God chose them. Just kind of because of the severity of the sins they committed. But I love how this verse clearly lays out just the development of sin, and it's something that I was able to kind of recognize that that's how sin starts in all of us, and me specifically. It's our human nature, and how sad is it that when we do get comfortable, we let our guard down. And it's not always an intentional decision we make, but Ephraim was surrounded by pagan cultures, and while they were successful and had influence, they let their guard down, and they were corrupted by what they had surrounded themselves with. They didn't have good boundaries physically or spiritually. And I think it's interesting if you look at the southern kingdom at the time and compare it with them, because they were also surrounded by evil, but at the center of all their land, they had the temple. And I think it's just a beautiful picture that they understood Torah and that they remembered the instructions and they guarded it close to their hearts. And that's where they were kind of saved from this destruction. And so to close out this portion, Hosea describes what Israel needs to do to be forgiven. And again, I just love how in this Haftarah it's so simple and easy to connect with. Hosea says to return to the Lord, say to him, "Forgive all our sins and receive us graciously, that we may offer the fruit of our lips." And that seems too easy, but it is because our God is so loving and good. And when you have established a relationship with him, when you have gone through the trials and wandered with him for 40 years, you do have that level of access and grace to forgiveness. It doesn't mean you won't sin, and it doesn't mean you should abuse that forgiveness, but it should be encouraging to you that God doesn't want us to walk in sin, and he does make it easy to come back to him and provides us that grace and forgiveness that we don't often give ourselves. And so I know it was kind of just a shorter teaching, but I hope that it was still just a blessing to you guys and that it encourages you as we go about our week.